Commander Lisa Grant noticed the missing food 2 weeks ago, and she kept careful records of everything in the human colony on planet. Viridian 7 and small amounts of protein packs and medical supplies were disappearing every few nights, and nobody seemed to know who was taking them. She decided to watch the storage building herself one night, and she waited in the shadows between 2 large metal boxes and the twin moons. Above made strange patterns of light through the tall trees, and at exactly 2:47 in the morning, she saw someone moving toward the building. The figure was tall and graceful, and moved like water flowing over rocks, and Lisa could barely see her because her clothes seemed to blend with the forest around them. And then Lisa saw the pointed ears and the glowing eyes, and she knew this was one of the native elves who lived on this planet long before humans arrived. But what made Lisa reach for her weapon was the creature following behind the elf woman. And it was a dragon about the size of a large dog with green scales that caught the moonlight. It's golden eyes that seemed far too intelligent, and it moved perfectly in step with the elf-like. They shared one mind. Lisa watched as the elf woman raised her hand and drew patterns in the air, and somehow the security locks on the storage building just opened without any sound, and the woman went inside quickly while the dragon stayed outside like a guard. 3 minutes later, the woman came out with a bag full of supplies, and she started to leave, but then she stopped suddenly, and her glowing eyes looked right at Lisa, even though Lisa had not made any noise, and the dragon turned its head and opened its mouth, showing teeth that glowed with inner het. Lisa stepped out with her hands up and her weapon still in its holder, and she said she was not there to hurt anyone. Elf woman moved so fast that Lisa barely saw it, and suddenly there was a bow in her hands made of living wood that seemed to glow, and an arrow was pointed right at Lisa's heart. The woman spoke, and her voice sounded like wind through old trees, and she said Lisa should not have seen her, and that humans had taken enough from these lands already, and she only took what she needed to survive. Lisa took a chance and said she knew. The woman was feeding her mother, who was sick. The elf woman's eyes got narrow, and she pulled the bow back a tiny bit more and asked how Lisa knew this. Lisa explained that the stolen items were only food and medicine, and not weapons or technology, and that someone who risked everything night after night was doing it out of love and desperation. The dragon made a low, growling sound like thunder, far away, and smoke came from its nose, but the elf woman raised her free hand, and the dragon went quiet. The woman finally spoke again and said her mother was suffering from a wasting sickness, and that the human colony had destroyed something called the Whispering Valley and cut down special trees that had been filtering poison from deep in the earth for 1,000 years, and now, without those trees, the poison was seeping into the water and soil, and her mother was dying from it. Lisa felt like someone had hit her in the chest, and the valley had been cleared 6 months ago for farming, and the surveys said there was nothing important there, but the surveys had been wrong. Lisa said she did not know about this, but that stealing would not save the woman's mother, and eventually she would be caught and humans would respond with force. The elf woman said simply that she would die fighting then, and so would her dragon. His name was Ember, and she would not watch her mother fade away while humans grew rich on stolen land. Lisa made a quick decision and offered to help, and she said the woman should come with her, not as a prisoner, but as a guest, and let Lisa help her. And her mother, the elf woman, stared at Lisa for a long time, like she was looking into Lisa's soul, and then slowly she lowered her bow, and the bow just dissolved into tiny lights and disappeared. Lisa asked, when they were in Messalai, said she was tired of making enemies, and if the human colony was responsible for this sickness, then they had a responsibility to fix it, and she introduced herself as Lisa Grant, commander of the settlement. The woman made her bow disappear completely and said her name was Kira Silverwind, daughter of Althea Silverwind and guardian of the eastern woods, and she pointed to the dragon and said this was Ember, her bonded companion since he hatched from an egg. Lisa held out her hand in the human way of making peace, and after waiting a moment, Kira took it, and her hand was cool and smooth like polished stone, and Lisa felt a small tingle where their skin touched. Lisa I told Kira to come to her quarters tomorrow night and bring any medical information about her mother. And Lisa had friends in the research division who were good people who cared about doing the right thing. Kira nodded slowly and asked what would happen if this was a trap. Lisa smiled a little and said, then Ember could eat her, and the dragon made a sound like it thought this was funny. Kara said very well, she would come tomorrow night, but if Lisa betrayed her trust, then war would come and it would not end well for the humans. Then Kira seemed to melt back into the shadows with Ember flowing behind her like liquid emerald. And Lisa stood alone in the moonlight, wondering if she had just prevented a war or made it happen faster. She went back to her room and could not sleep because she kept thinking about poisoned water and dying mothers and the fact that her people had caused this without even knowing it, and she realized that ignorance was not the same as innocence. The next day felt like it lasted forever as Lisa prepared for the meeting, and she cleared her quarters of anything classified, and she sent a message to her friend Dr. Amy Walsh, who worked in the science labs, and told her to be ready for something important. Night came. Lisa stood by her door waiting, and she felt nervous in a way she had not felt since her first day of command. And this was different from facing enemy soldiers, because Kira was not really an enemy, and that made everything more complicated. Exactly 9 o'clock, there was a knock on her door, and Lisa took a deep breath and opened it. Kira stood there, with Ember beside her, but they were not alone, and behind Kira was an older elf woman who looked like Kira might look in many centuries, and she was clearly very sick. The older woman had silver white hair that flowed down her back, and her eyes were clouded over with a milky haze, and she moved slowly, leaning on both a wooden staff and on Kira's arm, and Ember walked behind them, quieter and smaller. Somehow, like he understood he was in the presence of someone important. Kira looked worried and said her mother should not have come because the journey alone was dangerous. But the older woman spoke, and even though her voice was weak, it had strange harmonics that made Lisa think of ancient songs, and she said if they were going to trust humans with their lives, then the humans should see what their actions had cost. Lisa quickly brought them inside, and she had set out water and simple food. She was not sure what elves ate, and she had cleared her small table for them. The older woman sat down in the chair Lisa offered, and she looked relieved, and Kira stayed standing with her hand ready to call her bow if needed, and Ember curled up at the older woman's feet with his head in her lap. Very gently the woman introduced herself as Althea Silverwind, and she said Kira had told her that Lisa offered help, and Althea asked Lisa to forgive her doubt. But humans had made promises before and broken them. Lisa said she understood and she would not insult Althea with empty words. And she needed to understand what they were dealing with before she could promise anything real. Althea nodded like she respected that answer, and then she raised her hand, and Lisa saw something horrible. The skin on Althea's hand was almost see-through, and dark veins spread underneath like cracks in glass, and they pulsed with something that was definitely not blood. And her fingers were twisted and the joints were swollen, and when her sleeve pulled back, Lisa saw the same darkness spreading up her arm. Althea explained this was the deep earth poison, and for 1,000 years the whispering trees had contained it, and their roots drank the poison and changed it into harmless minerals, and the trees had been planted by her ancestors after the last poison bloom killed half their people. Lisa felt sick, and she said the surveys showed nothing and no intelligent work and no environmental system. Skara said bitterly that humans looked for machines and technology and not for living systems. That were the technology, and the trees sang to each other and shared information through roots that went for miles, and they were not just trees, but one big organism that filtered and guarded, and humans cut them down to plant wheat and corn. Lisa asked how long ago the symptoms started. Althea said 3 months after the first tree was cut down, and at first it was just being tired, and then the darkening began in her hands, and then it spread, and healers tried everything in traditional medicines and spells from their greatest magic users, and nothing stopped it, and at best they slowed it down. Lisa asked about elven medical technology, and surely they had advanced treatments. Skyra said they did, but the medicines needed ingredients from the Whispering Valley itself, and plants that grew in soil filtered by the trees, and mushrooms that fed on minerals the roots made, and all of that was gone now, replaced by human crops, and they had some supplies left, but they were running out, and Althea was not the only sick one because 17 others showed early symptoms and the poison was getting into the groundwater and spreading with every rain. Lisa felt the weight of responsibility crash down on her shoulders like someone had dropped a building on her. And this was not enemy action or a natural disaster, but a preventable catastrophe. Caused by rushing and not caring enough to look carefully, she told Kira and Althea that she needed samples of water and soil from their territory and biological readings from Althea if she would allow it, and Lisa had a friend named Dr. Amy Walsh who was brilliant and, more importantly, actually cared. About the native populations on colony worlds, Kira asked what would happen if this. Amy Person could not help, and her hand moved toward where her bow would appear, and she asked if Amy was just another scientist who saw elves as interesting specimens. To study, Lisa said firmly that if Amy could not help, then she would find someone who could, and she explained that Althea was dying because of decisions made by Lisa's people, and that made it Lisa's responsibility to fix it, and not as a favor, but as a duty she owed. Althea stared at Lisa with those clouded eyes, and for a moment Lisa felt like the old elf was reading her very soul and looking at every thought and feeling she had ever had. And then slowly Althea smiled, and it was a sad, tired expression, but it carried hope somehow. Althea said. Lisa spoke the truth, and she could feel it in the way. Lisa's words resonated, and she reached out her twisted, corrupted hand, and Lisa took it without hesitation, and the skin was cold, and the veins underneath pulsed with wrong dark energy. Althea said very well. They would trust Lisa, but time was not on their side, and she had maybe 2 months before the poison reached her heart, and after that no power in this world or any other could save her. Lisa said then they had 2 months to work a miracle, and they would start right now, and she told Kira to bring everything, including water samples and soil and any medical records the healers had made, and Amy would need to see Althea and run tests, and it would not be comfortable. Althea said quietly that comfort had left her a long time ago. But if this suffering could prevent a war between their peoples, then maybe it served a purpose. Lisa asked about war because Kira had mentioned it before, and she wanted to know how close they were to actual fighting. Kira and Althea looked at each other, having one of their silent conversations, and finally Kira spoke and said the clan elders were meeting in 5 days to vote on whether to drive the human colony from the planet by force, and many had lost patience with peaceful coexistence, and they saw human expansion in machines and disregard for the ancient balance of the land, and they remembered the last time outsiders came to their world. Lisa asked what happened then, even though part of her was afraid of the answer. Althea's voice took on the sound of a story told many times, and she said, the Korthian Empire came 3,000 years ago in ships of black metal, and they wanted minerals from the mountains, and when the elves refused to leave their homes, the Korthians brought war, and the fighting lasted 100 years, and by the end, half of the forests had burned, and a third of the elven people were dead, and the Korthians were driven back to the stars, never to return. Kara added that elves remembered this, and they remembered that outsiders, no matter how peaceful they seemed at first, always took more than they gave, and Althea counseled patience. But she was one voice among many, and as she grew weaker, so did her influence in the council. In the council, Lisa stood up and walked to her window and outside. She could see the colony lights twinkling peacefully and humans going about their evening activities, completely unaware that they were standing on the edge of destruction, and she had reclassified. Reports about the native population and the elven clans had magic that could level mountains and dragons that could burn entire space fleets, and knowledge of this planet that would make any war a nightmare for humans. Lisa turned back to her guests and said, then they had 5 days to prove that humans could be different, and 5 days to show they could fix what they broke and be partners instead of invaders, and she asked Kira if she would help. Kira looked at her mother, who nodded very slightly, and Kira said they would help. But Lisa needed to know that if the elders voted for war, then Kira and her mother would fight alongside their people, and gratitude would not stop them if it came to that. Lisa said she would not expect anything else, and family came first, and it always should. Ember lifted his head from Althea's lap and looked at Lisa with those intelligent golden eyes. And the dragon breathed out softly, and Lisa could have sworn she saw approval in that ancient gaze. Kira helped her mother stand up to leave. Althea spoke once more and said Lisa had a good heart, and that was rare among leaders, whether human or elf, but hearts alone did not stop wars, and Lisa would need strength and cleverness and more than a little luck in the days ahead. Lisa smiled a little and said, "Then it was good." She had a dragon on her side now, and she nodded at Ember the dragon. Snorted, and a small cloud of smoke escaped his nose, but his tail moved in what might have been amusement after. They left. Lisa stood alone in her quarters, feeling the weight of the coming days pressing down on her, like gravity had suddenly gotten stronger, and she pulled out her communication device and wrote a message to Amy Walsh and marked it urgent and classified. The war had not started yet, and there was still time, but the clock was ticking, and she could hear each second falling like a hammer hitting metal. The next morning, Lisa found Amy in her laboratory, which was on the lowest level of the research building. And Amy had chosen that location to keep her sensitive experiments away from the general colony population. And when Lisa arrived at 6 in the morning, she found Amy already working with her red hair pulled back in a messy knot and her lab coat stained with things. Lisa did not want to identify. Amy said, without looking up, that Lisa was not kidding about this being urgent, and she had been studying the biological samples Lisa collected from Kira the night before for 3 hours, and she asked Lisa what the hell humans had done to this planet. Lisa said grimly that they had destroyed a natural filtration, a system that had been working for 1,000 years, and she asked how bad it was. Amy pulled up a holographic display showing 3-dimensional images of molecular structures that twisted in ways that made Lisa's eyes hurt, and Amy pointed at the image and explained this was the deep earth poison Althea had mentioned. And it was not a normal toxin, but something between heavy metal contamination and radiation poisoning, mixed with something Amy could not even classify, and it bound to organic tissue at the cellular level and fundamentally corrupted the structure. Lisa asked if Amy could treat it. Amy said not with anything in their standard medical supplies, because their medicines were designed for human biology and elven bodies. Different enough that most human drugs would be useless or would actually hurt them, and she would need samples of traditional elven remedies and detailed biological scans and time, which they did not have much. If Lisa told her they had less than 5 days before the elven clans voted on whether to start a war with the colony, and less than 2 months before Althea died, and they needed faster solutions, Amy stared at her and said war, and she pointed out they had 200 colonists and maybe 50 with any combat training, and what could humans possibly use against a species that had been on this planet for thousands of years? Said quietly that humans had superior technology and orbital support, and the fact that High Command would destroy the entire planet before allowing a colony to fall to native forces, and that was exactly why they could not let it come to war, because whether humans won or lost, everyone would die. The weight of those words hung in the air between Lisa and Amy like smoke that would not clear, and Amy turned back to her displays, and her fingers moved quickly across the controls as she pulled up new information, and she said, "Okay, let me think about this, and the poison spreads through water and soil, right? So humans needed to either neutralize it at the source or recreate the filtration system the whispering trees had provided." Lisa asked if they could replant the trees. Emmy said not fast enough, because even if they had seeds, which they did not, because the machines had mulched everything they would be looking at, years of growth before the trees reached useful maturity. And she pulled up geological surveys of the Whispering Valley and said, but maybe humans did not need to replant. And what if they could synthesize the filtering mechanism and create an artificial system that copied what the trees did? Naturally, Lisa asked, using what template, because they did not even have samples of the original trees. Emmy's eyes got bright with the particular look of a scientist who just had a very dangerous idea, and she said, "No, but the elves probably did, and they might have preserved samples or genetic material, or maybe even complete biological databases." And she explained that elven magic was not just mysticism, but biotechnology so advanced it looked like magic to humans, and if the elves would share their knowledge, and if humans could combine elven biological understanding with human engineering capabilities, then maybe they could build something that would save both Althea and prevent the spread of the poison. Lisa Ash finished the thought and said they might be able to do this, but it required cooperation at a level neither side was ready for. Ami said firmly, then they would make both sides ready, because the alternative was unthinkable. Lisa made her decision quickly and told Amy to contact Patricia Kane in engineering and tell her Lisa needed her best people for a classified project, and Lisa was calling an emergency meeting with Colony Director Helen Shaw because if they were going to do this, they needed official permission and resources. Amy warned that Helen was going to panic when Lisa told her they were facing a potential war. Lisa said good, because maybe that would motivate Helen to actually listen instead of just approving whatever the farming contractors wanted. 3 hours later, Lisa stood in Director Helen Shaw's office, which was a space dominated by large windows overlooking the fields of the valley, and those fields had been bought with elven suffering, though Helen did not know it yet. Helen Shaw was in her 50s and a career administrator who had earned her position through political connections rather than actual colony experience, and she listened to Lisa's explanation with an expression that went from disbelief to anger to fear before settling on bureaucratic deflection. Helen said slowly that Lisa was telling her the farming expansion had poisoned the native population, and now they were considering wiping out the human colony. Said that was the short version. Yes. Helen asked what Lisa's solution was, and did she want to partner with the elves and share human technology with a potentially hostile force. Lisa countered that the elves were only hostile because humans gave them good reason to be, and she pointed out that they had a narrow window to turn this around, and if they could cure Althea, Silverwind, and neutralize the poison, they would demonstrate good faith, and more importantly, prove that cooperation benefited both species. Stood up and walked to her window, and she said the farming expansion was approved by the colonial authority, and surveys showed no intelligent cultivation in the valley, and they followed protocol. Lisa said bluntly that the protocol was wrong, and the surveyors were contractors paid by harvest numbers, and they saw what they wanted to see and ignored evidence that did not fit their quotas, and both Lisa and Helen knew this happened all the time. Helen was silent for a long moment, and then said if they stopped operations in the valley and redirected resources to this remediation project, the authority would demand explanations, and they might even recall her from her position. Lisa said if they did nothing, they would be dealing with a war that could end with orbital bombardment and the EHS extinction of a species that had lived on this world since before humans discovered fire, and she knew which legacy she wanted to leave. Helen turned from the window, and Lisa saw the weight of command she herself carried reflected in the older woman's eyes. And Helen asked what Lisa needed. Lisa said, full access to engineering resources and permission to negotiate with the elven leadership and Helen's backing. When the authority started asking difficult questions, Helen pointed out that Lisa was asking her to risk her career on this. Lisa said she was asking Helen to help save lives on both sides. Helen sat back down at her desk and started pulling up permission forms, and she said she would give Lisa 1 week, and if Lisa could show real progress, Helen would fight for more time. But if this went wrong, and if the elves attacked or the authority found out they were sharing technology with native forces, then both of them were finished. Lisa said she understood, and she felt the tension in her shoulders ease a little because it was not full support, but it was enough to work with. As Lisa left Helen's office, her communication device made a sound, and there was a message from Kira that said her mother's condition was getting worse, and the elders' meeting had been moved up to 3 days from now, and time was running short. Lisa walked faster toward the engineering division because 3 days meant they had 3 days to work a miracle with technology they barely understood and political obstacles that could destroy everything. She found Patricia Kane in the main engineering bay, surrounded by holographic blueprints and looking as exhausted as Lisa felt, and Patricia was young for her position at barely 30 years. Old, but her genius with complex systems was undeniable. Patricia said without any greeting that Amy had briefed her, and she had been running computer simulations of a possible filtration array based on the geological data from the valley, and the good news was it was theoretically possible, but the bad news was they needed detailed information about the tree's biological processes that they simply did not have. Lisa asked what would happen if she could get Patricia that information directly from elven sources. Patricia's eyes got wide, and she said Lisa had access to them, and then she paused as understanding came to her, and she said the thefts everyone had been talking about. And that was first contact, was not it? Lisa said that was need to know information, and asked if Patricia could work with. Elven biotechnology specialists, if Lisa arranged a meeting, Patricia said could she, and the chance to learn from a species that had been doing genetic engineering since before humans left the caves, and she would work with anyone for that opportunity. And she asked when they could meet the elves. Lisa said tonight at her quarters at 9 o'clock, and she added that they would be bringing a dragon. Patricia's smile was slightly wild, and she said even better. Lisa spent the rest of the day coordinating and planning and preparing for the evening meeting, and she got medical equipment and cleared her quarters of anything classified and sent a carefully worded message to Kira outlining the proposal. The response came an hour later, and Kira said they would come, but her mother was weakening by the hour, and whatever they did had to be done quickly. As twilight fell over the planet, Lisa stood in her quarters, surrounded by humanity's best and brightest people waiting for elves and dragons to arrive and hoping desperately that cooperation would prove stronger than fear. The knock on her door came exactly at 9 o'clock, a varying balanced on the next few hours, and it would either be war or peace. The meeting in Lisa's quarters looked like something from a strange dream, with humans and elves crowded around tables covered with holographic displays and organic samples that glowed with their own inner light, and Ember had curled himself into the corner with his golden eyes watching every movement like a predator, and Althea sat in the most comfortable chair Lisa could find, but her condition had clearly gotten worse, even from the night before. Akira stood behind her mother like a statue, guarding something precious, and her hand never moved far from where her bow would appear, but her attention was fixed on the holographic display Patricia had created, which showed a three-dimensional model of the proposed filtration. Ariakara admitted that it was elegant, and humans were trying to recreate the symbiotic network and the flow of toxin to transformation that the Whispering Trees had maintained. But she gestured at the mechanical components and said this was crude, like using a hammer where a scalpel was needed. Patricia said, undaunted by the criticism that was exactly why they needed elven help, and she asked Kira to show her how it should work and teach her the principles. Althea raised a trembling hand, and suddenly the hologram changed completely, and the mechanical components remained, but now organic structures weaved through them, like root networks that pulsed with energy, and chamber systems that looked like living organs, and flowing pathways that seemed to breathe. Althea explained in her weak voice that still commanded attention that the trees did not simply filter, but they communed with the poison and understood it, and transformed it through biological alchemy, and they were not machines, but partners with the deep earth, mediating between the hunger of the planet's core and the needs of surface life. Emi leaned forward with her scientific mind clearly racing, and she said so it was not just chemical filtration, but active biological transformation at the molecular level, and the trees were breaking down the toxin and reassembling it into beneficial compounds. Kara said yes, and the minerals. The trees produced strengthened elven bones and enriched the soil and fed the very life force of the forests, and it was a cycle millions of years in the making, and human machines broke it. In an afternoon the accusation stung, but Lisa could not argue with it, and she asked if they could rebuild it and not the original, because she understood that was lost, but something that could serve the same function. Althea and Kira exchanged glances in another of their silent conversations, and Althea said finally that perhaps they could, but not with human technology alone, and not with elven biological knowledge alone, and it would require true synthesis with human engineering. Married to elven life shaping, Lisa asked how long such a system would take to build. Patricia said 3 weeks or perhaps a month, if they had all resources and encountered no obstacles, and her fingers danced across calculations. But that was assuming perfect cooperation and no political interference. Akira said flatly that her mother had less than 2 months, and the elders' vote was in 3 days, and even if they began immediately, neither timeline favored them. Weight of impossibility settled over the room like a heavy blanket, and they had a solution, or at least the beginning of one, but not enough time to implement. Itami said suddenly, wait, and she pulled up a new display and said, what if they were thinking about this wrong, and they did not need to cure Althea with the filtration system, because that was for long-term environmental remediation, and for Althea they needed something immediatecra. Said their traditional medicines were used up, and the plants they required were Ganemi, interrupted, and said gone. Yes, but not the knowledge of how they worked and if. Kira could describe the biological mechanisms of the traditional remedies then. Amy could try to synthesize analogs using compounds they had available. It would not be perfect, but it might buy them. Timakera countered that. Amy would need to understand elven physiology at a level no human had ever achieved, Amy said then. Teach me, and she pulled up a biological scanner and said, let me study you and learn how your bodies process these compounds, and she was a quick learner, and she had access to the most advanced biology lab in 3 sectors. Lethia smiled weakly and said Amy had spirit, and very well they would do this. But Kira needed to know that elven biology was complex, and their magic and their physical form were intertwined in ways human science might struggle to understand, Amy said with confidence, that bordered on arrogance that magic was just science humans did not understand yet, and they should work to figure it out together. What followed was the most intensive collaborative research session Lisa had ever witnessed, and Amy and Kira worked side by side with the scientist and the elf, sharing knowledge that their peoples had kept separate for thousands of years, and Patricia and Althea discussed the principles of bioengineering with the old elf's magical understanding finding common ground with the young engineer's technical expertise. Surprisingly proved useful, and the dragon's fire, Kira explained, was not mere burning, but a form of controlled energy release that could speed up biological processes, and when Amy needed to test synthesis reactions, Ember provided exactly measured heat that no human furnace could match ours. Past and coffee was consumed in amounts that would horrify medical professionals, and data accumulated and theories were tested, and slowly, impossibly, a treatment protocol began to emerge, me said, as dawn light began filtering through the windows that it was not perfect, and the analog compounds she could synthesize were maybe 60% as effective as traditional elven medicines. But if they gave them in higher doses with careful monitoring, then it might work, Kira finished the thought as she studied the chemical formulas with eyes that burned with hope for the first time since Lisa had met her, and she asked her mother what she thought. Althea had been dozing to save her energy, but she opened her clouded eyes to look at the proposed treatment, and she said it was bold and dangerous even, and the doses required would tax even a healthy elf, and in her weakened state. It was risky, Lisa said, but it was a chance, and it was better than the alternative. Valthea agreed and said yes, it was a chance and she would take it, but they must move quickly because the elders' gathering was tomorrow evening, and she must be well enough to attend and speak on behalf of cooperation, and without her voice, the war faction would dominate the meeting. Amy decided they would start treatments immediately, and she needed to set up monitoring equipment and prepare the doses. Elisa interrupted and said they would do it here in her quarters, because if word got out that they were treating an elf, there could be panic, or worse, there could be sabotage, because the farming contractors would not be happy about potentially losing their valley. Clamskura said, looking at Lisa with her luminous eyes, that Lisa risked much for Kira's mother and for her people, and she asked why and what did Lisa gain from this. Lisa met her gaze steadily and said, peace and understanding, and the knowledge that humanity could be better than its worst impulses. And was that not gain enough? For the first time, Kira smiled, and it was a genuine expression that transformed her face from stern beauty to something almost warm, and she said, perhaps humans were not all as blind as she had feared. The next 24 hours blurred into a desperate race against time, and Amy gave treatments while monitoring Althea's vital signs with equipment that had never been designed for elven biology, and Patricia worked on early filtration array designs, consulting with Kira whenever magical principles intersected with engineering needs. And Lisa coordinated everything while also running interference with curious colonists and filing reports to Director Shaw that were creative in their interpretation of events and remained constantly at Althea's side, and the dragon's presence seemed to stabilize the old elf in ways that went beyond physical comfort, and Lisa caught Kira watching the bond between her mother and the dragon with an expression of such deep love and fear that it made Lisa's heart. Achikara explained during one of the rare, quiet moments that Thea had raised Ember from an egg and found him abandoned after his mother was killed. by a rock slide, and she nursed him and bonded with him and gave him a place in their clan, and he would die for her. Lisa. It's observed that Kira would die for both of them. Kira confirmed without hesitation that this was true and they were her world. And if they fell, she would fall with them. By the evening of the elders' gathering, Althea had shown remarkable improvement, and the dark veins in her arms had faded from black to deep purple, and her clouded eyes had cleared slightly, and she could stand without support for the first time. In weeks, and it was not a cure because Amy was very clear about that, but it was enough to buy time, Althea said as Kira helped her prepare to leave that. Lisa and her scientists must come with them, and the elders needed to see what cooperation had achieved. Lisa asked if that was wise, and was it smart to bring humans into what she assumed was a sacred space. Althea replied that these were desperate times that demanded desperate measures, and besides, Lisa had earned the right to speak because she had shed no blood and stolen no land and made no false promises, and in 3 days she had done more to heal the breach between their peoples than any human had attempted in 3 years, and the elders would hear her. So Lisa found herself along with Amy and Patricia, following Kira and Althea deep into the forest beyond the colony's borders, and they walked paths that seemed to shift and change as they moved. An ember flew overhead, occasionally visible through breaks in the canopy, and he was a living guardian, ensuring safe passage. The elven gathering place was a clearing dominated by 7 ancient trees that were so large they made even the mighty giants of the surrounding forest look small, and their trunks were easily 30 feet across, and their tops were so high they seemed to brush the stars themselves, and carved into the trees were symbols that glowed with soft light, and arranged in a circle beneath them sat the elders, who were 7 elves, whose very presence spoke of ages beyond human understanding. They were not all alike, and some appeared young with unlined faces despite eyes that held centuries, and others showed their age in silver hair and weathered features, and one was missing an arm, and another bore scars that suggested old combat, but all of them radiated power that was magical and physical and political. As Althea entered the circle leaning on her staff but walking without Kira's support, a ripple of surprise passed through the gathering. The eldest-looking elf spoke, and his voice sounded like grinding stones, and he said, "Althea Silverwind, we heard you were dying, yet you stand before us." Althea replied that she was still dying, Elder Marcus Kane, but she was dying slower, thanks to the efforts of these humans. All eyes turned to Lisa and her companions, and the weight of that collective gaze was almost physical. Another elder demanded to know how Althea dared bring outsiders to their sacred circle, and this was a female elf, whose green eyes flashed with anger. Althea countered that she brought proof that cooperation could succeed where conflict would only destroy, and in 3 days these humans had achieved what she thought impossible, and they had developed a treatment for the wasting sickness and designed a system to restore the deep earth filtration the valley once provided. Marcus Kane said those were pretty words, but words they had heard before from other outsiders who promised much and delivered only death. Lisa stepped forward with her heart hammering but her voice steady, and she said, "Elder Kane, humans could not undo what was done, and the whispering trees were gone, and that loss was on humanity's conscience, but they could prevent further harm, and they could build something new, and not a replacement for what was lost, but a partnership that benefited both peoples." The angry elder asked why elves should trust humans, and pointed out that humans had been there 3 years and done nothing but take. And they cleared the sacred valley and poisoned the waters and expanded ever outward with no thought for who stood there before them. Mamay spoke up, surprising everyone, including Lisa, and she said because some humans were trying to be better, and she was a scientist, and her job was to understand life in all its forms, and when she learned what the farming program had done, she was horrified because humans broke something beautiful and ancient out of ignorance and greed, and she wanted to help fix it, not as punishment, but as partnership. And other elders said they did not need human partnership, and they needed humans gone, and back to their stars, and back to wherever humans came from, and leaving the planet to those who understood its rhythms. Lisa said bluntly that was not going to happen, and High Command would not abandon this colony, and if elves attacked humans, would respond with overwhelming force, and orbital strikes, and atmospheric toxins, and possibly even biological warfare. And they would burn this planet to bedrock before admitting defeat, and she had seen the emergency plans. The clearing fell silent. "Marcus." Kane's voice was cold, and he asked if Lisa was threatening them. Lisa said no, she was being honest about the realities. They both faced, and elves could not drive humans away without triggering a response that destroyed everything, and humans could not expand without eventually provoking a war they might win, but that would cost them their humanity in the only way forward was cooperational. Thea said that Lisa spoke truth and she had looked into Lisa's heart and sensed her intentions, and Lisa carried no lies and sought no advantage. Beyond peace and her companions were the same, and they risked their careers, and perhaps their lives to heal what their people had broken. The angry elder countered that one human's good intentions did not excuse the Speciescara, said speaking for the first time that no, it did not. But good intentions offered a beginning, and a foundation on which to build trust. And she had seen them work through the night combining elven knowledge with human knowledge and creating treatments, her mother responded to, and she watched them risk official punishment to help elves. And they were not like the Corthians, and they could learn and they could change. The elders talked among themselves in their musical language, and it was a debate that Lisa could not follow, but whose intensity was clear, and finally Marcus Kane raised his hand for silence. He said they would allow this experiment to continue, but on conditions, and first, all expansion into elven territories must stop immediately, and second, the filtration array must be built under joint supervision with elven life shapers working alongside human engineers at every step, and third, if Althea's condition got worse despite these treatments, they would vote again on the question of war, and fourth, he fixed Lisa with a gaze that seemed to look into her soul, and said Lisa would serve as guarantor, and if humans betrayed this trust, they would hold her personally accountable. Lisa understood the weight of what was being asked, and she would be hostage to humanity's good behavior and responsible for every colonist's action and liable for any breach of faith, and it could destroy her career or end her life, or both. She said without hesitation that she accepted. The gathering dispersed slowly, with elders approaching to examine Althea's improvement and to question Amy about the treatments, and to discuss engineering principles with Patricia, and Kira stood beside Lisa with Ember at her feet. Kara said quietly that Lisa had bought them time, but time for what? And was it time to build trust, or time to prepare for an inevitable conflict? Lisa replied that was up to all of them, both human and elf alikes. 6 weeks later, Lisa stood at the edge of what had been the Whispering Valley and marveled at the transformation, and the farming fields were gone, replaced by a massive hybrid structure that seemed to grow as much as it was built, and towers of living crystal rose from the earth, wrapped in engineered vines that pulsed with energy, and beneath the surface, a network of artificial roots spread through the soil, drinking in the deep earth toxins and processing them through chambers where human technology and elven magic worked together. Filtration array was working ahead of schedule and exceeding all expectations, and water samples from downstream showed toxin levels dropping by 40%, and soil contamination was reversing, and most miraculous of all, new shoots were emerging, which were seedlings of the whispering trees cultivated from preserved genetic material in elven archives and nurtured in the hybrid environment. The array provided. Damie stood beside Lisa, looking exhausted but triumphant, and she said, "A month ago?" She would have said this was impossible because biology and technology did not merge like this, but they did it. Lisa corrected her and said Amy did it along with Kira and the others, and Lisa just made it possibly. Kira approached with Ember at her side, and the dragon was now noticeably larger than when Lisa first saw him, and Kira said Lisa did more than that, because she risked everything to give them a chance, and the elders spoke of Lisa with respect now, and some even with admiration. Lisa asked how Kira's mother was doing. Kira's smile was answer enough even before she spoke, and she said Althea was stronger every day, and the dark veins were gone, and her eyes were clear, and yesterday she danced for the first time in a year, and Amy's treatments combined with the improving environment had given her life back, and Kira said they gave her mother back to her. Althea herself came out of the array's central structure, deep in conversation with Patricia, about some technical aspect of the biofilters and the transformation in the old elf was remarkable because she looked years younger and moved with grace instead of painful slowness, and her presence radiated the power that illness had. Dimmed over the following weeks, the partnership deepened and elven artisans began trading with human merchants, exchanging unique goods that could not be made through human manufacturing, and human doctors talked with elven healers, comparing notes on medical techniques and discovering surprising common ground. And